Okay, so it's about 3 o'clock, maybe a few more seconds until we reach that point in time, but nevertheless, we can slowly make our way into this present issue of the reflections, the FRIAS reflections. And I'm very grateful that Massimo and LEONE agreed to give this talk. So Massimo already opened our lecture series in the Humanities Social Sciences Colloquium, and now Massimo also is very early in making a contribution to the FRIAS reflections. I don't think Massimo needs a great deal of introduction, but let me just say that he is a professor of philosophy of communication, cultural semiotics, and visual semiotics at the Department of Philosophy and Educational Sciences at the University of Turin. He does a whole lot of things. I will not mention all of them, but he has published and edited enormously. He is the chief editor of Lexia, the semiotic journal of the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Communication in Torino. And among other things, he currently holds an ERC Consolidator grant. His project at FRIAS is on transhuman portraits, artificial faces in art, science, and society. And today's talk, to some extent, is related to this, but maybe he will also share with us some experiences he made when, among other things, he experienced the Paris lockdown in spring. Massimo, we want to learn more.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. It's always a pleasure meeting you and the other fellows at FRIAS, and to contribute to the thriving intellectual life of FRIAS, nevertheless, despite the pandemic. So, mirror selfies and Alephs on mobility travelogues. There is a relation between these, which is more of an intimate, personal talk and a research project at FRIAS. Probably the most important modification that we have all experienced in our lives as scholars in the last months. It has concerned the impossibility to travel. I was a compulsive traveler, and so memes of this kind of started to appear in the internet. The Lonely Planet travel guides that have been replaced by volumes detailing how to be a traveler in the lounge, the kitchen, in the stairwell, or a volume dedicated to casa, which is home in Italian. Or also some self-ironic memes about expectations for traveling in 2020 between the Opera House in Sydney and some dishes to be washed that happen to be the same shape. But also, of course, irony about the vacation and summertime to Italy with the shape of a mask on the faces of travelers, and also the disgregation of disrupting old habits of travelers, including the influencers. So myself, I was locked down in France for the first wave, and now better conditions in Germany, so I'm experiencing different kinds of national lockdowns. And of course, my mind went to someone who was locked down in Turin, but in a different way, is Xavier Demaitre, who in 1790, when he was serving as a young soldier in the city of Turin, illegally engaged in a duel against a Piedmont officer, a Patrono de Meiron, and defeated him. So as a consequence, he was sentenced 42 days of confinement in his own room at the Cittadella of Turin, that still exists. You can visit the military citadel. And there, during the confinement, he wrote his most famous book that has been quoted many times, especially during quarantines, although often in a superficial way, which is the Voyage autour de ma chambre. The Journey Around My Room has been translated into English, first published in Turin in 1794. So Demaitre tried what I also tried during my lockdown in France, to make the most of his confinement, and reversed the rationality of travel literature into a radical innovation, so describing exclusively what he would see in his own room, but looking at it with the eyes of a traveler. He wrote what is maybe the first masterpiece in the history of what I would call anodeporics. Odeporics, as you know, is the branch of literature that is about travelogues, travel literature. So he's probably the first author of anodeporics. That is the literary and philosophical description of a journey through immobility within a confined space. And this is a very early edition of the Voyage autour de ma chambre that's unfortunately back in my house in Turin. So some passages of this book are particularly interesting also as regards the study of the face in travel literature. And this is when my research project somehow also intersects this personal and contingent interest of mine. Indeed, since Demetre was alone in his room, meeting no one else, the only visages he would lay his eye on were those in the prints hanging from the walls. Like l'œil fixe et hagard, le visage immobile, the fixed and haggard eye, the motionless face of Count Ugolino in a dantesque illustration decorating one of the room's walls. So the most interesting passage of the Voyage by Demetre on the face is, however, the passage in which he describes, with usual irony, the most beautiful image a room traveler could come across. So what is the most beautiful image? What is the most beautiful painting that a room traveler can come across? Is the mirror. And of course it was irony toward the already egocentric mentality of people of that epoch. So Demetre writes that probably the only category of people who would not be completely engrossed by mirrors would be the philosophers. So the philosophers would probably be the only one to question, like a traveler would do, the image that they would see in a mirror, exploring it, not through a habit, but as an unknown territory to be known better. So he writes, peu de monde y jetterait les yeux et personne ne s'y raconterait excepté les philosophes. Few people would look at it and no one would recognize himself. None save philosophers who spend their time examining themselves. But he adds, j'en doute même un peu. I even have my doubts about the philosophers. So even philosophers are very egocentric and they would probably be engrossed in the mirror as well. So, what is the relation between mirrors and faces? Well, of course, so we have all produced pictures of our faces using this special format, which is the selfie. Have written extensively on the selfie, especially this article, Semiotics of the Selfie, the Glorification of the Present. And the selfie is a kind of a fusion between a mirror and a camera. This is my most famous German selfie with Angela Merkel in the background, and then if you want, after in the question time, I'm going to tell you the story of the selfie. But nevertheless, what is the relation between these and what Demetre says? Well, during the pandemic, selfies have tended to decline. Even the data sets that I examine with artificial intelligence and other quantitative instruments indicate that there are very few selfies around now, for various reasons. People during the first lockdown could not take care of the faces by cosmetics, get a haircut, to trim their facial hair. But there was also a second, most fundamental motive. Selfies are a digital mirror, yet they require a frame, and their frame is the world. They need to visually state that the face deserves the foreground in relation to what stays in the background, be it artworks or famous people. In confinement, in lockdown, in quarantine, there is no chance to come across any extraordinary background. And of course, in the beginning, I've taken selfies on myself in Liefman House, but after the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth selfie in Liefman House, that becomes a little bit redundant. So the selfie loses its reason for being. Nevertheless, in keeping with Demetre, one might wonder about the possibility of a moral selfie, a digital representation of one's face whose purpose would be that of evaluating through the face one's soul, and to do so philosophically through a gaze that is alert to moral ugliness. And this is what some artists do. For instance, this fantastic Taiwanese artist whose name is Han Su-tung. This is a creation from 2020, and he has these wonderful sculptures that use wood, but at the same time, they reproduce the aesthetics of the pixel, and the very telling title of this sculpture is "Where is the like?" So where is the like for our selfies now that there is very little to be shown in our back, behind ourselves? So the work by the maître was imitated many times. It became a sort of a reference to all those that would imagine a journey in a confined space, in a room. One of them was Wilkie Collins, that nevertheless was also the first one to point out that there is a problem with the maître's method. Wilkie Collins in 1852 contributed a short story entitled A Terribly Strange Bed to Household Words, the magazine edited by Charles Dickens, a story then republished in 1856 in a series of 6 called After Dark. And, well, the story is very simple. There is someone who, in Paris, goes to a gambling house, he wins a lot, and they drug him. So they convince him actually to stay in the bedroom of the gambling house. And it's exactly in this gambling house that the protagonist tries to imitate the maître. So he cannot sleep at night because he has been poisoned, although he doesn't know it. He thinks that it's because of caffeine. And so he says, while my eyes wandered from wall to wall, a remembrance of Lemaitre's delightful little book, Voyage autour de ma chambre, occurred to me. I resolved to imitate the French author and find occupation and amusement enough to relieve the tedium of my wakefulness by making a mental inventory of every article of furniture I could see, and by following after the sources the multitude of associations which even a chair, a table, or a washhand stand may be made to call forth. So he tries to imitate the maître, and you can use the same method in your own apartments at FRIAS. So try to travel around your apartments and live one house, and then we can compare notes. But here is exactly where the maître's method shows its limit, because this is a tricky bedroom, and the bed where the protagonist of the story, Wilkie Collins' story, is staying, has a canopy that is little by little descending on the protagonist because it is going to crush him and kill him. So this is the limit. When you are actually anguished, when you are actually you feel entrapped in a world that is shrinking exactly like this canopy that is coming down and down, it is very let's say difficult to go philosophical and travel around your own room. But now let's go toward the conclusion. Wilkie Collins too had experienced an epidemic and the ensuing quarantine. Indeed, when he was a child, he was traveling with his father from France to northern Italy. Wilkie Collins' father was a painter, and they were blocked by an epidemic. After the epidemic conquered the entire world, they started studying the history of epidemics and also the literary works that were created as a consequence of them. And you find so many similarities. You find conspiracy theories, you find love stories, you find... we are living something that is special for us, but probably is not so special for history. So it's a recurrent phenomenon in human history. And another reference to this, let's say, relation between epidemics and a new occasion for reinventing traveling is in this other very famous work by João Batista de Silva Leitão de Almeida Garrett, known as Almeida Garrett, who was also found in Oporto when the cholera struck the city between 1832 and 1833. He was a patriot, he was a liberal, and at some stage during his confinement, he wrote the Viagens na minha terra, which is translated in English as Travels in My Homeland. And there is a passage where he again quotes the Maître by saying que viaja a roda do seu quarto, que está à beira dos Alpes. It is understandable that someone travels around his room, being on the edge of the Alps in winter, in Turin, which is almost as cold as St. Petersburg. So this Portuguese author is saying, well, the Maître was in Turin, so Turin is pretty cold, is almost as cold as St. Petersburg, where the Maître actually would subsequently die. So this is why he journeyed in his room. But actually, I'm in Portugal, I'm in Lisbon, so I'm actually entitled to have a little bit of a wider journey. And this is what he did. So he journeyed in the county of Lisbon, he went to the countryside, and he wrote the first travelogue about one's own land, which was, of course, also a political act. So it was a way to write a travel guide, but also a political description of what was happening in the country during the pandemic. And I will conclude with Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, who, as you all know, in 1945, in the journal Sur, published a beautiful little story called El Aleph, and El Aleph also quotes the Maître. Of course, Borges was a mighty reader, and he wrote in the Aleph, "Mine eyes, as did the Greeks, have known men's towns and fame. The works, the days and light that fades to amber, I do not change a fact or falsify a name. The voyage I set down is, the voyage I set down is, autour de ma chambre." And the story, as you know, is about this miraculous device that is hidden downstairs in an apartment in Buenos Aires in the 1940s that allows one to go to a mystical travel. So the Maître was not a semiotician, was not a philosopher, of course, yet he realized by his sensibility made more acute by the confinement that we do not really look anymore at what surrounds us in our intimate space, perhaps because we are too engrossed in the dream of long distance and adventurous journeying. The Maître reversed the cliché. What if the real adventure were nearby and not far away? And what if, on the opposite, a bundle of stereotypes hid in the dreaming and practice of remote journeying? What results from such reversal is a rhetorical appeal to intimate discovering, starting from what is more familiar to us, that is the paintings at the walls of our room, although there are no paintings at the walls of the Liefman house, those that we do no longer observe, but also from the more familiar of paintings, that face of ours in the mirror that we seem to know, but that in reality constantly escapes both our vision and our introspection. And let me conclude with Shakespeare, Hamlet 2:2. Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Massimo. Just your last two lines from Shakespeare remind me that I'm a member of the English department and actually should also be able to examine English Lit. So wonderful. It gives us some hope too. I mean, the whole talk actually did. All right. There is plenty of time for discussion and we have many guests today. I'm actually also very happy to see on some black tile that Michael Butter from Tübingen is with us. So hi, Michael.
Hi,
you don't have to show
Michael.
your face. I know you're there. So is there a comment, a question to Massimo? And even if you don't have a question, just watch his wonderful device. You know, just look at how small and how big he can become. He can even stand in the picture. I saw it myself, actually, believe it or not. So I'm still fascinated. So the room is open for questions.
Yeah, I'm very pleased that Michael is here because conspiracy theories are very important during pandemics, but not only during the pandemics that we are living in. Historically, looking historically at previous pandemics, you see all these conspiracy theories that are created. Mikhail has just published a wonderful book on conspiracy theories, so it's a wonderful coincidence.
Maybe then, since you mentioned me, I can ask a question if that's okay, or maybe it's more of a comment, because it can't be a coincidence that you're giving this talk at FRIAS, because it reminded me of the fact that many years ago when I was a student at Freiburg, there was another student who went on to do a PhD in German literature, and he wrote about a local writer, Friedrich Freiherr von Zink, who lived in Emmendingen. And he wrote a text which is called Reise in meinem Zimmer herum. Published in 1798, so a journey around my room. So you've given us all the big shots of European literature. So once you're there, maybe this is worth checking out. This is the only thing I can contribute to this wonderful book. Thank you so much, Massimo.
Thank you very much. Indeed, this idea that now it doesn't look so original because it has been so many times imitated, but it was tremendously successful to the point that Demetre then wrote a follow-up, a sequel of the book. It was the Voyage Nocturne autour de ma chambre. So it was a nocturnal night journey around my room. It was widely imitated in the literature of those years. Yeah.
Okay, I can't see all of you at once, so but if someone just wants to go ahead, shout, or just shoot and go ahead.
If I may.
Yeah, Javier.
Massimo, once again, it was very, very interesting. I think I'm going to give you all my slots to speak in this phrase, because you do it much better. Now, I was interested by many things, but one in particular when you said something about that the level of the number of selfies had tremendously declined during the period of pandemic because of this lack of the world or the travel as the appropriate frame for revealing your own personality to others. I was thinking, why do you think it happens? Why do you think it's easier for some people, not necessarily with a very philosophical mind and to the exploration of the characters you described in your presentation, but people, simpler people, why do you think it happens to them that they may think they find themselves more easily when they are exploring alien lands instead of in their own domestic environment?
Well, I would say that probably a point of departure to answer your question is a reflection on selfies and what kind of format they are. And of course, the selfies could be taken after a front camera was added to smartphones. But at the same time, they also satisfy a need, which is a semiotic need, is a symbolical need, is also a psychological need. Some say, well, it is the glorification of egocentrism, of narcissism. I don't think it's so easy and so simple. The point is that non-digital pictures were used very often in order to keep a memory of the past and to keep memory of something that was considered as memorable. You know, like my mother still has at home some albums that are full of analogic pictures, you know, to remember a wedding, to remember parents, and so on and so forth. But the kind of relation that selfies have with memory is different. When you take a selfie, it's not because you want to hand down to the future an image of the present which is considered as memorable, because nobody actually looks back at digital pictures. We don't certainly look back at our digital pictures as we would look back at printed analogic pictures. So the point of the selfie is not to keep a memory of the present for the future, but to bestow an aura of memorability to the present itself. So the present is actually not memorable in many cases. It is banal. We go and visit places that so many other tourists have visited. We go to bars and drinks and have food in experiences that have a very illusory taste of distinction. And so the selfie is a way to bestow this aura of yes, it is a memorable moment. Yes, it is something that must leave a trace of it in the future, but will not be actually looked back at normally. At the same time, the conditions for this kind of glorification of the present have somehow disappeared during the pandemic. Somehow, for people, it was very difficult to glorify the present when this present was home, was a private space that was not distinguishable anymore from a public space. So, in these terms, I would answer your questions.
If there is no further questions, Javier, is there a follow-up?
No, I think that this idea of the memorability. So what I find is a contradiction, Massimo, between this idea of my image is not so important in terms of transmit to others for whatever purpose, but this has become even just a sort of addiction for many people. This habit of sending selfies to a certain group of people, and at the same time, a frequent comment that I have heard in the past months is that many people with different levels of culture, they have like rediscovered many things that they have forgotten about: domestic life, family life, personal time, time for reflection. So what I find is a little contradictory, this idea, I don't have anything to transmit through an image of myself, and at the same time, I have found parts of myself I have forgotten with the passage of time and with the turmoil of daily technological life.
Yes, this is true, but this is why I was mentioning Wilkie Collins and the idea that yeah, you can travel around your room, but at the same time, if the canopy is coming down to kill you, your your state of mind is not really philosophical. I mean, it reminds me many conversations I had with Iranian friends about the relation between censorship and creativity. So does censorship increase creativity? And many of my Iranian intellectual friends, they would say absolutely not, because actually it's a forced creativity. It's not the free creativity. And the same, the kind of self-philosophical reflection that you have during a pandemic is unfortunately obligatory. So there are no alternatives. And this is what probably limits as well the scope of these philosophical discoveries. So they would be much more revolutionary if we were actually able to travel, but we decided not to. But if we are actually obliged not to travel, what comes out of it, it might be something that renew our point of view on life, but at the same time, it also stems from a condition that is not voluntarily chosen. At least this is my point of view.
Right. Further comments or questions? I mean, in case of doubts, it's always it always falls to the director of the institution to ask the least intelligent question, but that question that everyone is really interested in. And none of us have forgotten the selfie with the back, right? So this must have been somehow a special moment. So give us the story.
Well, it was a special moment because it was absolutely a coincidence. The last Congress I attended before the global spreading of the pandemic, I mean the face-to-face, was in Berlin, and it was organized by Humboldt University by a group of scholars working on Slavic studies, Balkan studies. And at the end of the first day, we went to a Chinese restaurant to have a dinner all together. And Angela Merkel just came in that same Chinese restaurant with someone she probably had to talk to, and she sat at a table, and they started to discuss. There was just one bodyguard. Everything was very discreet. So we were really impressed, actually, by how light this presence was. But I couldn't resist taking a selfie, of course, a stolen selfie.
Okay. Well, if you want to take a similarly prominent picture or selfie in Germany, you have to wait at the right little Italian cafe and try to get a picture of the national coach of die Mannschaft.
Exactly.
That's about the most prominent thing you can succeed in doing. Veronica, do you have a question? Is this just okay? So, well, if there are no, yes, Tim Freitag.
If I may, I was 2 minutes late. My background is in human geography and to some extent tourism and mobility studies. So for me, the selfie, like the first thing I think about is the technological part of that. So I would be interested in like looking into science and technology studies, for example. Do you find it helpful, useful to some extent to include this technological dimension, even as an actant in your philosophical considerations, or is it completely apart, disconnected? How do you deal with that technological challenge?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I tend not to be a technological determinist. So, for instance, when people or even journalists used to complain about the fact that teenagers do not talk to each other anymore because they have their cell phones. The opposite might be true. They have their cell phones exactly because they are not supposed to talk to each other anymore. And anyway, there is a co-determination of technological devices and, let's say, social-cultural attitudes that become predominant in a certain human group. So it is true that the introduction of the front camera together with the rear camera was necessary in order to spread a culture of the selfie. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that it determined it, it co-determined it. In other cases, the determination is stronger. For instance, there is a Chinese company for, let's say, digital cosmetic apps. It's called Meitu. And it has created some cell phones that do not have a rear camera anymore. So you can take only selfies with those phones, which is quite interesting because, it is a complete reversal of the initial technology. And the same goes also because the selfie is not only a camera, it's also filters. So filters are also very interesting because there again you have an increased capacity to post-produce images, which is due also to technological advancement. But at the same time, if you look in a recent article, I've looked into beautifying filters around the world, digital filters for the face, and it is certainly not without consequences that the beautifying filters of many areas of the world, in Asian countries, for instance, are whitening filters. So what they do is actually to make the color of the skin of one skin fairer, but they are not called whitening filters, they are called beautifying filters. So this is of course something that stems from technology but has a clear post-colonial or even neo-colonial background.
Yeah, as you can all see, my personal video filter for actually filtering all the red colors is currently broken, so this is why I just have my normal healthy red here. Anyone else? If not, then I just thank Massimo and I thank all of you for joining us. The reflections are always supposed to be short interventions of 30 minutes, including discussion.